And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the director, Nora Jacobson. Nora, are you there?
I am, but I can't turn on my camera
That's fine.
because you said I couldn't. I mean,
Oh,
it says that you have to allow it.
I will do the tech support while we answer questions and things like that. All right. Yeah.
I'm trying to start the video, but it says, what does it say? It says, you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
How rude of me. Let's enable that. Well, I'm going to figure out how to do that. Chris, do you have a question for Nora to start things off?
Sure. And thank you so much, Nora, for joining us for this.
Pleasure.
And for sharing your film with us. Kevin mentioned at the very beginning of this, I first saw this film back in, I want to say it was around 2006, when I was in grad school for urban planning at Rutgers. And I've remembered it ever since, just because I think it chronicles, so much of what was going on at a time of a lot of change in Hoboken. So I just think it's a really great film, and have appreciated it for a number of years.
Oh, thank you. Are you still working in urban planning?
Yes, I'm a transportation planner now. That's kind of what I came out of school doing. So I work for a transportation consultancy in New York, but I do get to chair the construction and planning committee of our Journal Square Community Association.
I see.
And we are going through a lot of change in our neighborhood at the moment. There's a lot of development happening in the Journal Square area right now. So
yeah, I bet. Yeah.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask, and I have a few, I won't monopolize the time because I'm sure a lot of people do, but I'll start with one. I just wanted to know, when you were making the film, did people who you were interacting with and interviewing, did they at the time know that you were kind of covering, all these different sides and angles of the story? And if so, did that affect, or did you perceive that affected the way that they viewed you, or the types of information that they shared with you? Or were they using you to communicate with the other side, or things like that? Just kind of how did that all work?
Well, that's an interesting thought, that they were using me to communicate to the other side. I don't think they needed me to communicate to the other side, really. Hoboken is a very small place. It's a mile square, as you probably know. And there was a lot of interaction and talk back and forth, especially at council meetings, where everyone would show up and scream at each other and talk to each other. So they didn't need me. But in terms of, did I tell them? I think when I first introduced myself to people, I would tell them that I was looking at all sides of the issue, which is what I was doing. I was interested in looking at all sides of the issue. So I think maybe that's why developers would talk to me as well as tenants. I think that's why, because I very honestly did, no matter what you might say about how the film turned out, and people have different opinions about that, my approach certainly was to show the whole system of gentrification, even though my sympathies were certainly with the people who were being dispossessed. So that's all I can say.
Nora, just so you know, you can turn on your video now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I tested it out. It works.
Oh, I'm trying. There it is.
There you go. Hello.
Hi.
I have a question. So the film covers a better portion of a decade, and it tells a compelling narrative. However, most people find local politics and city council and zoning board meetings to be pretty dry stuff. How did you do the trick to make these things compelling? And, could a young filmmaker just start recording public events and expect a similar result?
Well, it took me a while to get to the point where I felt like I was getting good enough images to use. When I first started in 1984, I was using a Bolex camera and a reel-to-reel tape recorder that weren't synchronized. And so it was, I wasn't getting, and it was just me alone going, and I wasn't getting good footage at all. And I had the opportunity to purchase a more professional 16 millimeter camera. But even then, I was doing the sound recording as I was trying to shoot. And I would do things like forget to turn on the sound, keep it on pause. And I mean, there's some pathetic shots early on that I didn't end up using. And I very quickly realized, or rather quickly, I should say, that I needed help. And so I found a couple of people to do sound recording for me. Deb Augsburger, Doug Lindsay were the main ones, but a lot of people did. And they were people who lived in Hoboken, who had rather low, marginal jobs, weren't always employed. And so they were, as was I. And so we were able on a dime to run over and film something that was happening because we were there, we were living there. In fact, at one point I lived in Manhattan for about a year, and I just said, forget, I can't live in Manhattan and make this film. I have to be living in Hoboken. And so I moved back to Hoboken. So in terms of making it interesting, well, I always thought those meetings were really fascinating and interesting, just to see people's faces and to see how they spoke and the passion that they had about the issues. I loved it. I have to say, in retrospect, looking at the film now, I think, oh my God, I could have, maybe gotten rid of some of those meetings. Maybe there are too many of them, because not everyone likes this film. I mean, there are people who think. I was at the Sundance when the film was at Sundance, and I was in the theater, and I was sitting in back of these two young women, and after the film, one turned to the other and said, "Oh, that's the most boring film I ever saw." So so there are people who find these meetings boring. And in all honesty, I think maybe if I had been able to make the film, instead of 118 minutes, 90 minutes, for example, the film would have gone more places, maybe. I don't know. It would have been very hard for me to cut out parts of the story, even when it felt like maybe the story was ending. It should be done. There was always something else happening that I wanted to include. And I think for people who love Hoboken and who are vested in the story, they don't mind the fact that it's 118 minutes. But I think others do.
And it is interesting because even though it's a longer film, it moves from place to place, and you can a viewer can follow the narrative even if you don't know anything about Hoboken. I read somewhere that there's initially a 3-hour cut of this film. What actually got edited out?
The waterfront. Yes, there was. And well, and the waterfront, it was about an hour, I think, of footage. Yes, the whole fight over the waterfront, I documented that as well. And just, I just couldn't fit it in. And I did end up making a short piece about the waterfront. I took all that footage, turned it into a chronology, and made it available to the people, the activists who were involved in that struggle.
Fantastic. Okay, we have questions from the group. So Michael, I'm going to bring you on first. You should be able to unmute yourself and join. Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
He's muted.
Yeah, you're muted and your camera's off if you want to turn it on.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, great.
Okay, Nora, I have a question. I don't know if my camera's on or not, but I'll go ahead and get this question out. When you were doing your filming, you focused more on the old apartments and the new condos. There are a lot of brownstone single family homes in Hoboken. Was there a lot of remaining Italian home ownership in the early 80s in Hoboken, or was most of that by then had become, yuppie New Yorker brownstoners? Do you remember?
Oh yeah, no, there were lots of Italians. Yeah, and a lot of brownstones that were owned by Italian families for sure, and
Okay.
Yugoslav families.
Okay. I have a little story for you if you'll indulge me. I ran a home ownership improvement program in Hoboken from 71 to 74. And what had happened was in the Hoboken in the 1980s, in the 1960s, census was still 80% owner occupant. And by 1970, it had become 70% owner occupant. It was very much an Italian place. And the city government, which was taken over by Steve Cappiello, who you have, the previous mayor, who you have in your film, decided that they were worried about losing their power base and the Italian homeowners. So we put together a 3% loan program, and about 500 or 600 homeowners upgraded their properties for about $10,000. This used HUD money and state money, but the interesting thing was that once those buildings were in better shape, I gather that Hoboken increasingly, it was appealing for these homeowners to make a bunch of money, selling out as it became appealing for people to come over the river and going out to the suburbs. But I remember twice standing literally next to the mayor Cappiello and handing out plaques to his people, the Italian homeowners, shaking their hands and congratulating them for using our money. So Hoboken really went through, various stages. I did less work with the apartments, but it was. Oh, the last thing I want to say is that by the late 70s, there had been enough moves in of wealthier people that they cut the HUD money off, because Hoboken was already getting overly high incomes.
Wow.
So just pass that on to you.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when I moved there, in, let's see, is it 1980, I guess. Yeah. And I started working on the film in 1984, but I was living and filming in Hoboken at that time. And everyone was saying how it was that the city was low, in bad shape. And, this was a defense for the gentrification, saying that it was in such bad shape. And so they needed this influx of newcomers. It was just beginning when I started sort of paying attention to it, which was in 1982, maybe. That's when I started being aware of what was going on. But yeah, I mean, well, you saw in the film, there is one story of an old sailor whose rooming house was bought up, and that was not exactly a brownstone because it was brick, but same idea, and it was a young developer who came in, and the people next door to him, it was a family, Irish family, I think. And they were, it was very odd, because on the one hand, they would say, oh, it's too bad, look what's happened to poor Harry, he has to leave. But on the other hand, there she was selling her, she had a for sale sign on her building. So it's such a complicated issue.
Yeah. I have one other very quick question. I noted that you're from Norwich, Vermont. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Had had you moved out in the 80s, or were you still, did you still have a property up there?
I live there. I returned there. That's where I live now to this day.
Okay.
Not on the property, not where I grew up, but about 5 miles away in an old train building right on the railroad tracks. So yeah, I returned to I returned to Vermont, not really because I wanted to, but because there was a film I wanted to make in Vermont, and I came back to make it, and then I never left for a bunch of reasons.
My parents owned property in Norwich and lived in Hanover for 30 or 40 years. And so I just noted that.
Really?
Yeah.
What's your parents'
He was
name?
a professor named Henry Ehrman. He was at Dartmouth College.
Yeah, I wondered about that. They were very, very dear friends of us, my parents. Very, very close friends. So I wondered when I saw your name.
Yeah, and I wondered if I remembered the name. So I'm glad I brought that up. Thank you for the film.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, next we're gonna go to Angelo. So I'm gonna bring you on, Angelo. You can unmute your microphone and turn on your camera if you wish. Angelo, you there? Hey, Angelo, just unmute.
Hi, Nora and everybody. I just put a little text chat. I was a witness to all of this, both in Hoboken and Jersey City. Those council meetings at Hoboken, I used to attend. We had mysterious fires. We had developers, landlords that were having their tenants harass. Just 2 blocks away from me, a developer had a 16-year-old girl beaten up and a 17-year-old boy beaten up. And my neighbors, their lights were turned off. They got pit bulls in there, and they would bring in certain elements into the building to drive other people out. What I was surprised, and I was also vice president of Jersey City Tenants Organization in the 80s and the 90s. Also, I was a school principal here in Jersey City, and many of my students were affected by this. I was a little bit surprised that maybe you didn't want to show the violent portion of that, because that actually happened in Hoboken, and the people here, developers or landlords, got the idea from Hoboken. You don't know how many people I've known in Jersey City, because I'm a native, I'm from here, and I both happen to be half Italian, half Puerto Rican, so I have both sides. And so I was a little bit surprised that you didn't want to show the violent part of it. You showed the fires, but the same thing happened 2 blocks away from me. I live downtown Jersey City, and the same thing is happening now with gentrification. I run a food pantry, and the rents have gone up a great deal because landlords from New York have bought buildings, and old timers that were paying $1,000, they're being forced to pay $2,200 or $2,000. So I run a food pantry that I have 300 people, and I could tell you some stories that will just melt your heart. People have enough money for their only for their rent and gas and electric, and that's it. We provide them food. We have donations twice a week from my church. And that's the food that they get. I had an old lady that was eating 3 cans of cat food a day with bread, because she could only afford to pay her rent and her gas and electric. So we're going through a gentrification process right now, and I've heard, and I'm going on and on because this is a very emotional issue for me, because as I've witnessed it in Hoboken, Jersey City, and now I didn't think that I would witness this again. So it is very touching to me, and it really touches me a great deal. Anyway, I just wanted to express that to you. But Yeah, no.
Thank you. Well, you have a good point about the fact that I didn't delve into the arson, for example. I mean, the arson was the big violent act in Hoboken. Now there probably were threats and pit bulls, but it was the fires that were on everyone's mind. And I decided not to, frankly, out of fear. It was scary. It was Hoboken had the reputation of being a
Tough.
place, yeah, where there was nasty, where there was maybe mob people that were active, and I didn't.
Yes.
I mean, so on the one hand, I didn't want to try to find out who was behind the most deadly fires. I also did want to keep access. I did want to be able to have access to the developers and the landlords, because I think if you let them talk, they will basically hang themselves if you give them the opportunity. So I kind of took that approach. But I think there should be someone or some movement to try to see who was behind who. There were many people behind the fires.
Yes.
And I don't know, by the time I started seriously making Delivered Vacant, some of the most serious fires that actually killed people had already happened, like the Hotel Pinto I'm thinking of. That was actually when I really first started to realize what was going on. And I made a little short film about it, but I didn't film the fire. I filmed the newspaper headlines because I didn't know about, it wasn't really on my radar yet. So I'm very sad to hear that this is happening again in Jersey City. It just seems like wave after wave, right? So you're saying that for a while it went away for a bit and then it picked up again? Is that what you're saying?
No, Jersey City has been gentrifying ever since it started in Hoboken. During that period, it started here. I was friends with Ira. Ira, the lawyer that you interviewed, and I used to go to council meetings in Hoboken, but developers and landlords got the idea for Jersey City. So that's when I became vice president Jersey City Tenants Organization, and we used to work with New Jersey Tenants Organization. And that's when you hear stories, I just don't want to get too emotional, an 80-year-old woman being thrown down the stairs in 1985 because she wouldn't move, so her landlord can't make her, the developer cannot make condos. Or you hear a 75-year-old man being beaten up by, so it did get nitty, it did get gritty, because it is very raw here. It was very raw in Hoboken, but Jersey City too. So that development has, and it affected a lot of my students, having been a school principal. And right now it's happening also because of not only because of COVID, but also because of the prices down here are outrageous in Jersey City right now. One bedroom goes for $2,500, and the condos next to me sell for $800,000 to $1.3 million, 2-bedroom condos. So I know all the stories of what people see. They see these lovely high rises or these condos or whatever. I don't see that. I see what's happened to people that I know, people that were immigrants and people that were poor. So I don't really celebrate it. And yet, for those of you that know me, I'm vice president of Van Voorst Park Association, and I was one of the original founders of the first association here in Jersey City. But so I'm very, very involved in the community, but I'm seeing it because I hear stories. And they're heartbreaking when you just have enough, and you've been living there for 40, 50 years or whatever, and you don't want to move because it's your neighborhood and you don't have money for food. And you can't get food stamps because they tell you that you're paying too much rent, that you're paying $2,000 a month rent. So it's a catch-22 situation. I have no animosity toward the new people that buy $800,000 condo, 2-bedroom condo next to me. But I knew all the people that lived there. I knew the people that were harassed. I knew the people that were beaten up. I knew the people that suffered a great deal. So I really don't rejoice, but yet, there has to be some balance. And that's what I was always looking for between developers and between the city. But now it's gotten really, really out of hand.
I wonder why during COVID it's bad, particularly you mentioned COVID, but I
mentioned COVID because what the issue with that is that people that cannot afford to pay taxes and pay a mortgage, they're selling their 3 or 4 story buildings, brownstones for $2 million.
I see.
For $2 million, and then other buildings that people come in from New York, they're buying them and they're forcing people out. If their rent control is more than 4 apartments, so they're forcing people out. People that were paying $800 a month rent are now, maybe paying a few thousand. So
Yeah.
Okay, I'll let everybody else talk. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks, Angela.
Sure.
Let's get this. And then Lysel, I'm going to bring you in next. Just 1 second. And then when you get in, Lysel, you can just unmute and turn on your video.
Hi. Thanks for the film, and Nora, and thanks for Jones School of Folks for giving us the opportunity to watch this. Out of curiosity, the family who moved to Costa Rica because they felt like they had to and they had no other better choice, do you know what happened to them? And I'm curious because you've allowed for their story. Their story is part of the narrative. And I think with a lot of developments in cities, the people that you presented are usually their primary characters, but they're sort of like never really looked at. I mean, everything pretty much becomes the pro forma or the dollar signs, but these are real stories that people have, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you got in touch with the family, and the kids must be all grown up now.
Oh yeah, they're all grown up. Yeah, they're thriving actually. Yeah, I mean, I'm in touch with them infrequently, but on Facebook, and so I see, how they've developed, and I think in a way it was the best thing for them because they held out for the buyout. The husband, as you remember in the film, was very, very very firm about how much money he wanted to, and gosh, he got it. And they went back to Costa Rica and were able to buy a business and a house, and their kids are all doing well, and now they're grandparents. I mean, yeah, it was a success story. I've never actually asked them, are you glad that you went back? But it just seems like they must be, just from the way they look. But I might ask them actually.
I wonder if they would visit, right? Because I also know people. I'm from Jersey City. I'm an architect and I'm an urban planner as well. And I actually know somebody from college who was an artist who lived in one of those. It wasn't an official SRO, but like she rented a room in a house with a number of artists, and it was a dilapidated house. It was a brownstone on. No, I'm sorry, it wasn't a brownstone. It was a row house on Garden Street, and she was very conscientious. And they made such a beautiful home out of this dilapidated house, and she just got sick of it and moved out. And I wish I had sent her the link to this film. She's now in upstate New York, and as far as I know, she's very happy over there. But she also felt that she was, you know, she was forced out,
Yeah.
and that's a sad thing because she would have been a great contributor in this neighborhood, being an artist that she was. So,
Yeah,
like, we lose some, I guess we gain some, we lose some.
exactly. Yes. Yeah. Well, you can't say, I mean, it's the whole idea of change is a big issue, how do you have change without hurting a lot of people? Um, Robert Moses, who I'm sure you know, being an urban planner, I think it was he who said you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, which is a horrible thing to say because he was likening it to having to displace people from buildings to build his highways through neighborhoods and stuff. But the question is, can you have change without some hardship? I don't know. I mean, the thing we were trying to do in Hoboken was to make the people who are responsible for the change make them contribute. That was the whole idea. That's why I spent so much time at those city council meetings, because that was the big story, was how do you get city government to exert pressure on the landlords, the developers, to try to mitigate what was going on. And they refused because they always would say, private property rights, I can do whatever I want with my property.
Yeah.
So it's a balance. And I hope that in Jersey City, there are efforts to make, why shouldn't the developers, why shouldn't they contribute? Why shouldn't they help keep people in a community? Obviously, they don't want to, but they need to be forced to.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like a lesson. This should be seen by people in the government, because I think if we leave the development of our cities to just developers, I think that imbalance that you referred to will happen, because somebody's got to watch out for the people, like the people who moved to Costa Rica, regardless of the fact that their lives got better. But I'm sure there are others whose lives got ruined, right? So it's at some point there's got to be somebody responsible, and it could be a collective. It could. I don't have the answer to that, but like, unfortunately, in the society that we live in, it's a dollar sign that makes it go.
Yes.
So
yeah, that's right. And the fact that there has to be constant growth, that you have to always grow more, bigger, rather than just, one of the things that was so great about Hoboken is that it was a mile square. It was this little place. Like, fortunately, I think, well, the last time I was there, it looked like they had been building fortresses on the waterfront. But why can't people just say, okay, enough is enough? Let's let it be the way it is.
Yeah. It's going to be the challenge. It's going to be the challenge for us all.
Well, you're in a perfect position to do something about it as a planner.
Yeah, I was also a volunteer. I've met Angelo, the speaker earlier. Yeah, there's also volunteer burnout. So when Sheila was talking about, it seemed like she was defeated. The same thing with Jody. I could totally relate to that, because these people are volunteering their personal time. The same people, the Journal Square folks. I know some of the founders of them, and they eat you up. They really eat you up. So, and there are people who are getting paid to do this job, right? Like, people in our elected officials. You hope that they would be a little bit more responsible for the position, with the position that they have. I'm not blaming any. I'm not pointing fingers at people, because it is a hard job. So
yeah.
But thanks again.
And I'm not accusing you of not doing enough.
No, I'm busy. I'm busy doing my share. That's true.
Yeah.
So
sure. Yeah.
All right.
Well, look at me. I moved to Vermont.
Thank you, LaSalle. I'm going to bring on Bill. He's got the next question. Bill, you should be coming on, and then you can unmute your microphone and turn on your video.
There he is.
Well, my video hasn't started. Okay, I'm here. Hi, Nora, great film. You know, I just posted in the chat a comment about the city of the city council here in Jersey City last year passed an inclusionary zoning ordinance, but it has gaping loopholes. And you know, I sit on the our construction and planning committee with Chris Lamb, and it's just so frustrating every time we hear these presentations from developers about new projects that they want to build in Journal Square. And we always ask them, do you plan to include any affordable units? And the answer is always no. And that's because they don't have to. And in the film, you mentioned that Hoboken did pass an inclusionary zoning ordinance in the early 90s, just before you finished your film. But you said in the film essentially that, well, there was so much development already, it was too late.
Well, no, not exactly. It was so watered down, though.
But did they get much in the way of affordable housing?
No, not from that. It was so watered down. You know, they kept decreasing it from, you know, any developer that was developing, you know, like four units. Then it was, they kept then let's see, how did it work? They kept making the bar lower, so that ultimately developers really didn't have to contribute, or if they did, it was maybe one unit in a 16 unit building, something like that. So it became pretty meaningless. That's my understanding. Now, I left in 94, I guess, very soon after finishing the film, maybe, no, 2 years after. And yeah, they had weakened that ordinance so much. That's what made people so angry.
Yeah. And a second question, how has the film been received? And, you know, I checked on Rotten Tomatoes and there were no critics reviews. I was disappointed to see. But I would imagine in urban planning schools, like Chris mentioned, he saw it in 2006 when he was in graduate school at Rutgers. Is the film viewed widely in those communities, at least among urban planners?
Well, we had a 2-week run at a theater in New York, Cinema Village. We got some great reviews in the New York Times and in the New York Daily News, the Village Voice. But it's not in Rotten Tomatoes, because I mean, I don't know how maybe Rotten Tomatoes wasn't even around then. I don't know, you know, it came out in 92. So I don't know if Rotten Tomatoes was around, and it didn't show theatrically that much. I mean, it showed 2 weeks in New York and then at festivals, but mainly schools and schools of urban planning, I would say, and individuals. I feel that the most avid audience for the film is people who have some connection to Hoboken, or people who are interested in the issue of gentrification. So, I mean, a couple years ago, I was invited to show it in Brooklyn, for example, you know, because they're going through gentrification there. And so I showed it there, you know, so it's pretty, yeah, I mean, it's not like a super popular film or anything like that. But I have to say, when I add up the people who buy the DVD or the download, it's added up over the years. I mean, there are a lot of people who have wanted to see the film.
Well, last point I want to make, I'm proud to say that the Journal Square Community Association is a member of Jersey City Together and its parent organization, New Jersey Together. And its priorities are affordable housing, tenant rights, criminal justice reform, and full funding for the Jersey City Public Schools. And I will recommend to the leaders of that organization that they show this film.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, some of them have already. I mean, I have seen it. I think I did show it once in Jersey City, or yeah, I think once. But so may I ask you, Bill, are you from Jersey City originally? Like, are you from Jersey?
I grew up in Bergen County, but I went to St. Peter's College back in the late 60s and early 70s. I was in an urban studies major, and then I was living away, but I moved back here in 87, and I've been here ever since.
Yeah, because really it's new. I mean, so you're not exactly a newcomer, but you in some ways you are. It's really people who come from elsewhere, who fall in love with their city, their town, their home, and then want to give back. I mean, that's what, and then mix with the people who were born in that town. And so that's, to me, where the hope lies, that people, it's when you use a place as a bedroom community and you just sleep there and then you go to work someplace else. That's the problem. And I think one thing about Hoboken is a lot of the newcomers, the young newcomers, the artists, I know certainly I felt this way. We felt so strongly about the place that we quickly started to get involved. I mean, I remember the first thing that I ever did was participate in an arts festival, a citywide arts festival, and so that's how you build the love that then turns into people participating and trying to make things better.
Well, Kevin and Chris are perfect examples of the younger people who've moved here and love this city and really want to contribute, and they are making a difference. And and we also have some people who are lifetime residents.
Yeah, it's so great.
Thanks, Bill. So Adam, I know you're the next person up who had a question, and just for everybody in the chat, I'm going to try, we're going to try and wrap up the questions pretty soon, but if anybody has another one, just use the raise hand function in Zoom and I can put you in the queue to ask a question. But Adam, go ahead.
Thanks, Kevin. And thank you, Nora, for putting this film together. I was actually texting with Kevin a little bit during the viewing, and it really is an emotional roller coaster. It kind of leaves you kind of, I guess, questioning what is the solution. And a couple of people have talked about Jersey City's poor attempt at an inclusionary zoning ordinance. And kind of what I like to call the faux IZO. But I guess, I think one of the issues that I kind of have always struggled with is ultimately almost everybody kind of ends up becoming a gentrifier somewhere else, right? I mean, wealthy people moved from New York to Hoboken and pushed out people from Hoboken who were ultimately wealthier than people wherever the people from Hoboken ended up moving. And it kind of becomes almost this vicious cycle in a way, because, you're seeing it right now, for example, in places like Boise, Idaho, where Californians who have been priced out of California are moving to Boise because it's cheaper to live in Boise than it is to live in California, and now it's pushing out native Boiseans. And it kind of leads to the question of, is there, in your point of view, a solution? I mean, I guess my feeling has always been, there does need to be some amount of development that includes affordable housing. And I think that Jersey City's very poor attempt at this is not the solution, because it really only requires 5% of units as affordable, and there are just so many loopholes that I mean, you might as well have had nothing rather than what they passed, because it's not worth the paper that it was written on. But do you see any kind of answer to this issue? Because ultimately, like I said, it is kind of a vicious cycle.
Yeah. Well, there is plenty of money out there in the world, and people could receive money to help them find other places to live. I guess that's all I can say, is that yes, there's always going to be that movement of people you can't control. You can't do the kind of social engineering, really, I guess, to say, well, you can't move here. Although I think some places, like I think Berkeley, California, has almost done that in some ways, but it's not. No, maybe you wouldn't want to do that anyway. So you can't prevent people from moving to a place that they find attractive and wonderful. But you can make it possible for people who are displaced to find another place to live. And the question is, so Hoboken 1 mile square, maybe so is difficult to fit. You have these newcomers come in. Where do the old timers go if they can't afford to stay? Could they build buildings up against the Palisades? I don't know. I just know that there's plenty of money in the world, and it's really up to the people who run the cities to be the ultimate, the people doing the social engineering to try to mitigate the pain and suffering. That's really that. I think that's all one can do, probably.
Mhm.
Do
Yeah,
you agree? I mean,
I do. I mean, I think, what was very interesting watching the documentary is, it's hard not to look at the time that this documentary was made, specifically, the 80s, and some of the rhetoric that was being employed even by so-called Democrats, that it's really hard not to notice that all of this was kind of happening against the backdrop of Reaganomics and kind of a general rethink of the social welfare system in most Western countries. I mean, it was happening under Margaret Thatcher as well, and I think it is very interesting. And I guess it kind of begs the question: is it just something that happens at a city level or a state level, or does this really need to be kind of a really holistic rethink of how do we prevent this as a nation, rather than how do we prevent this as a city or a state?
it would be great if one could do that. Is that happening? Can that happen? The whole idea of this is a little bit of what I was talking about earlier, about this idea that you have to have constant growth, that and that the profit motive is the most important motive. Can you shift that paradigm? I would like that. I would hope so. I think it's up to the next generation of people to do that. And I don't know, you're young. What do you think? You think that can change, that the profit motive can be replaced on a national level?
I mean, I do think that there are certain programs in place. I mean, I ultimately, like in transparency, I work in the low-income housing tax credit industry, which kind of provides a profit incentive to provide affordable housing. And I think that is a potential solution. I don't know if it's the total solution. I will say that as somebody who I appreciate you calling me a younger person. I think that as a quote unquote younger person, it feels pretty desperate right now for our country. I mean, I think that things that used to seem pretty black and white in terms of good or bad no longer do. So basic humanity seems to have gone out the window a little bit. So it feels a little bleak right now, but I think it's definitely worth trying.
Right. There are some landlords who actually, they feel, and this is, we talked about that a lot. I remember at these meetings, there were our landlords who didn't feel like they had to make a killing. They would get their rents, and if they didn't make enough to pay their expenses, they could go in front of the rent controlled board and get an increase. So there are people out there who don't feel that they just have to make a killing with everything they do. That's why I do feel that there has to be a paradigm shift in terms of not feeling that the goal in life is to make as much money as you can. Right?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I guess just one other quick follow-up question. The tenants who were able to purchase their condos, how did they fare in the end? I know that DC has a program called the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, where if a building is in the process of being purchased by a developer, the tenants can form essentially a condo association and purchase their units. So I'm curious how the tenants in Hoboken fared, following the purchase of their units.
I think they, for the most part, held on to them. It was the Sheila's building, and then the Mr. Trivedi, the block on Park. Those were the two examples in the film, and I believe Sheila and Tim are still in their units. I think Jody moved to Boston. But I think that was a success story. Mr. Trivedi and the Indians on Park, I think so too, but I don't know for sure. I do think that was good, but not everyone could have afforded that. Like the tenants on 11th and Willow certainly couldn't afford that.
Yep.
So that's really more for the middle class.
Yep.
So
no, absolutely.
Can that happen for lower income people? I don't know.
Yep. Well, thank you again for creating this excellent documentary.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Norris, if you can unmute yourself or turn your video on. Norris, are you there? Oh, there.
Yep, there I am. Hi. Start the video. Okay, here we go. So this even in Jersey City, I knew someone who lived in Paulus Hook, which is now a very expensive area to live. And she had a lease, and someone on the ground floor had a 30-year lease, and the landlord wanted them out and hired people to go in and cut the beams in the roof to make the building unstable, and then had the city come in and declare that this building was unstable, and all of those people had to get out quickly. But that was the landlord himself did that, and that happened probably in maybe 2003 or so in Paulus Hook. But I think that really the only way for people to have control is to own their own home. So programs that make home ownership a possibility, and also make sure that people aren't paying too much, because we had such a housing crisis when people paid way too much for homes, and then their homes were underwater, and they had predatory lending, and so those are big programs that have to be overseen. So maybe at a national level with Federal Housing Authority or the people who give the loans out. But in my own life, if you rent, you're always at the mercy of a landlord. And if you have a great landlord, someone who isn't in it to make a killing, as you say, then you're better off. But you still are subject to, you have that uncertainty.
Yeah. Well, maybe you're right. Maybe there could, some people who are very imaginative could come up with some ways that low-income tenants could band together and buy their units. That would be great.
Yeah, and I think we have tried that, and we do have programs here in Jersey City. And I'm thinking specifically of 111 First Street, which that was an artist's enclave. LaSalle, if you're still on, and Bill, you'll know about that building. But that was an old factory building that artists had moved in and tried to buy their units, and the landlord did not want to sell. And the building was demolished. Everyone had to leave, and it's still an empty lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Nora. I think Chris and I have a question, and I was going to give Chris the final word.
Okay.
But yeah, one of the things I really like about this film is that it's a series of cycles repeating. There's condo conversions, right? There's SROs being turned into a new apartment building. There's political administrations coming in and out. And their processes repeat over and over the course of the film. And then here we are in the real world, and they've been, churning like a laundry machine ever since. But they always play out a little bit differently each time, right? So I would say my question to you is like, looking at the world as it is today, 30 years later, if the film has a moral, have modern cities and their leaders learned it? Politicians, developers, voters, tenants, you put the film out into the world to try and share this knowledge, share this story, and there's other people that are trying to share the story of gentrification, displacement, and, the economics behind housing. Are we learning the lesson?
Well, the fact that you're doing what you're doing, yes. I mean, but it's incremental. It's maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So, and that's what can be very discouraging for people. You just have to keep the faith and do a little bit at a time, and just hope that you can persuade a few more people. So no, it's not a big victory, but I think there is progress little by little. Yeah, I hope so.
I do like that you mentioned that about the big victory. Initially, when I wrote the question, I asked if somebody won, but that's not the question, right? Because you show in the film, even the developers didn't win. Some of them went bankrupt. The tenants didn't necessarily win. The politicians didn't win,
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, it doesn't have a Hollywood ending. It's not a Hollywood film.
I can tell you the real world hasn't either, so it makes sense.
Yeah.
Chris, did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess kind of on a similar theme. I was thinking while watching this film and thinking about, development in our community here in Journal Square, that, and Adam was kind of talking about this too, that the problem and the issues and the solutions and everything really are bigger than a single neighborhood or a single city can really take on. I mean, when you look at housing, it's at minimum, it's a regional thing. We're part of this huge New York metropolitan region. And if in Journal Square we create enough inventory where, everyone has a place to live and prices are affordable for everyone. Can we do that satisfying the local need within Jersey City, or do we just kind of start drinking from a fire hose of kind of taking on that burden for the entire metropolitan area, where, you have New York City not keeping up with demand in the city. You have suburban communities with, acre zoning, and they're not creating, tons of supply of housing there. So just, the dynamics of the situation. And I think I don't know if this is really a question, but really just wanting to discuss a little bit more about this.
Well, if you can do Journal Square, I mean, so is Journal Square all developed now? Like,
it's developing. So we have a redevelopment plan that's been in place for about 10 years. But we're seeing kind of the products of that upzoning around Journal Square kind of taking place now. So we've got some new 50 and 70 story buildings right around the transit center that are coming online. And our committee has reviewed like 40 or so high-rise projects in the Journal Square area that, maybe not all of them will actually end up getting built, but a good number of them likely will. So it's an area that's changing a lot right now and will be continuing to change for years to come.
Yeah, I mean, Jersey City is very different from Hoboken just because it has more land. I mean, it's much more spread out. And I guess it's a question of, do you want to live in a big city?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also I think the development is taking on it's a little different here in that, Hoboken, you're showing a lot of condo conversions of older buildings, that the old buildings are staying there, it's just they're becoming condos. Yeah. Downtown Jersey City, at least by the waterfront, you had new buildings being built where there were rail yards before.
Yeah.
Whereas in Journal Square, it's older homes, older buildings that are being gobbled up, demolished to make way for brand new buildings.
Yeah, well, it's too bad. I mean, it's nice to have older buildings in a city, that texture, so I don't know. I hope you can do something about not demolishing everything that's old.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because we do have a large supply of new housing, but does that mean that everyone gets housed, right? So then that's the question.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Inclusionary zoning, it's.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, again, it's changing the idea that developers need to make as much money as they can. I mean, that I harp back on that, but I think it's pretty important. But it will take a really big shift in consciousness and to make that happen,
Yeah. That's one of the things I think about during Chris's question is the movie starts, or sorry, the film starts at 1982, 1984, but and goes forward from there. But when you think about it, you have to think of the larger forces that got Hoboken where it is. The growth of the financial industry in New York City, deindustrialization of the waterfront, the ports moving to Newark and away from Hoboken. Those things all existed prior, right? So.
Yeah, the forces are, well, it's fascinating. By the way, I was looking at my old urban studies books because every time I make a film, I collect books about the topic. And I don't know if you know anyone who would like my collection of urban planning books, but I would love to make them available to people who might need. You probably don't need them. You probably read everything online, but I just wanted to put it out there if there was any interest.
Chris?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I enjoy sitting on my hammock and reading and geeking out about urban studies and planning topics is a great
really
fun. Yeah,
it's fascinating. I mean, the growth of cities, it is an amazing study. It's an amazing field. It really is about our civilization. It's the growth of our civilization.
I
Louis
just want
Mumford.
to check on time. We're coming
yeah.
on about an hour. It looks like we have one more question from the group. Is
Okay.
that okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, Michael, I'm going to bring you on for another question, and then we'll call it a night.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Don't discount a factor that's not been mentioned today that was very relevant to what Nora's done, which is that the federal housing programs totally collapsed when Reagan came in. And so any possibility of getting developers interested in doing a very different thing than converting those buildings to condos had disappeared, just a few years before Nora's period, which is relevant to Hoboken because there is a company called Applied Housing, which had done in the late 70s some very good stuff on 5 or 6 blocks in Hoboken for subsidized rental housing. But the 236 and Section 8 development programs that they used, Reagan killed it in 81. And there's some replacements now, sort of, but they had not been developed throughout the whole 80s. So the tools to do something different than Nora portrayed just weren't there.
Right.
Okay. Thank you for that comment.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. You're a city planner, aren't you, Michael?
I ran housing rehab programs in Hoboken and Westchester County, New York, and then worked for the federal government around the country in getting folks to do housing rehab. Later on, I became an appraiser and did historic property and various kinds of things like that. But the program that I started in Hoboken created a career for myself for the next 15 years of taking the model we used in Hoboken and applying it to other cities around the country.
Neat. What was the name of the program?
They called it the Hoboken Municipal Home Improvement Program, and it was funded through an agency called the Hoboken Model Cities Program, which had disappeared essentially by the time you did your program. It became Hoboken Community Development and then lost its funding.
Right. Well, Michael Coleman was part of it, and Ralph Seligman.
Michael Coleman was my boss.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Neat. Great. Well, nice to connect with you, Michael, and with all of you.
Likewise.
All right. Well,
thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any closing comments or?
No, not really, but I'll get your address, Chris, so I can pack up those books and send them to you.
Hey, that sounds great. But for COVID, I'd be heading up to Barre, Vermont at least once a month. VTrans is one of our big clients.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I'm working on the state rail plan right now.
Oh, cool. Oh, that's so great. Well, when COVID is over, stop by and visit.
Awesome.
Okay. All right.
All right. Fantastic. Well, from Hoboken to Vermont, we're making connections.
Yes, we are.
Thank you so very much for making your time available for us. Thank you for making the film available. We really appreciate it, Nora.
It was my pleasure talking with you all.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay.